Okay, so you want to own an offshore wind farm. Turbines taller than skyscrapers, standing in open ocean, spinning out clean power for decades. That's the pitch every government in the world has been selling for a decade. Here's the problem. Right now, in 2026, the offshore wind industry isn't struggling to grow. It's being paid in cash to disappear. Picture the scene the brochure shows you. A horizon full of white turbines, blades turning slowly, no smokestacks, no fuel trucks, nothing to buy every day, just electricity flowing out of the ocean for free, forever. That's the emotional pitch, and it's not wrong exactly. Wind is free. The problem was never the wind. Here's what the brochure doesn't show you. An offshore wind farm isn't really an energy business. It's a 25-year bet on interest rates, steel prices, and government policy that happens to spin. And once you understand that, the current state of this entire industry stops looking like a mystery and starts looking completely predictable. Let's start with what it costs to get a single turbine standing in the ocean, because put some windmills in the water is hiding an enormous amount of engineering. The headline number is cost per megawatt of capacity, and offshore is brutally more expensive than its onshore cousin. Onshore wind turbines run somewhere around $1 to $1.5 million per megawatt to install. Offshore runs 2 to 3 times that. Industry benchmarks now put offshore capital costs somewhere between $3.5 and $4.5 million per megawatt once everything is accounted for. And a detailed bottom-up UK assessment of a typical project lands even higher, at roughly £3.47 million per megawatt. Run that against a genuinely serious project, a 1 gigawatt farm, 1,000 megawatts, the scale of many real developments currently under construction or recently cancelled, and you're looking at somewhere around $4 billion before a single blade has turned. Here's where people get the cost breakdown backwards. You'd assume most of that $4 billion is the turbines themselves, the towers and blades and nacelles you can actually see from shore. It isn't. Turbine hardware typically makes up somewhere around 40% of total project cost. The other 60% is what the industry calls balance of plant, the foundations that anchor a several hundred-ton structure to the seabed, the subsea cabling that carries electricity back to land, the offshore substation that steps up the voltage, the specialized installation vessels, and the onshore grid connection work. You are not really buying windmills, you are buying an underwater construction project that happens to have windmills bolted on top of it. And the foundations alone explain why offshore costs so much more than onshore. Depending on water depth and seabed conditions, developers choose between fixed bottom foundations, driven or drilled directly into the seafloor, and floating foundations moored with anchor chains for water too deep to build on. Floating technology unlocks vastly more ocean, but it currently costs meaningfully more than fixed bottom, with lifetime energy costs estimated around $145 per megawatt hour for floating versus roughly $95 per megawatt hour for fixed bottom projects today. Every foot of water depth you add to a project is, in a very literal sense, added directly to the bill. There's also a scale arms race happening inside this cost structure that's worth understanding because it cuts both ways. The newest offshore turbines being installed today generate 12 to 15 megawatts each, more than double what a typical turbine offshore produced just a decade ago. And a single one of these newest generation units can cost in excess of $400 million fully installed. Bigger turbines mean fewer foundations, fewer vessel trips, and fewer maintenance visits per megawatt of capacity, which is genuinely why costs per megawatt have been falling for years. But it also means each individual point of failure is now a much larger, much more expensive single asset. And the specialized vessels capable of lifting and installing components this large are scarce and booked years in advance, which is itself becoming a bottleneck the industry didn't have when turbines were half this size. Now let's talk about what it costs to keep those turbines spinning once they're actually standing, because this is where offshore wind quietly separates itself from every other renewable energy business. Maintaining equipment in the middle of the ocean is nothing like maintaining equipment on land. A technician can't just drive out to a broken turbine. They need a specialized crew transfer vessel, sometimes a helicopter, and a weather window calm enough to safely transfer people onto a platform standing in open water. Miss that weather window, and a repair that would take an afternoon onshore can take weeks offshore, all while that turbine sits idle, earning nothing. Saltwater is relentlessly corrosive to steel and electrical equipment, which means more frequent inspections, more coating and corrosion protection, and components that wear out faster than their onshore equivalents ever would. For a full-scale 1 gigawatt project, all-in operations, maintenance, and service costs run somewhere in the neighborhood of €88 million a year. a bill that arrives every single year for the 25-plus year life of the project, rain or shine, whether the wind blows or not. Then there's the cost almost nobody budgets for correctly at the beginning: decommissioning. Every offshore wind farm eventually reaches the end of its operating life, and someone has to remove hundreds of turbines, their foundations, and miles of subsea cable from the ocean floor, using the same expensive, specialized vessels required to install them in the first place. Developers are increasingly required to post decommissioning bonds or reserves years in advance, locking up capital against a bill that won't come due for 2 decades, for a job that current cost estimates put in the hundreds of millions of dollars for a large-scale project. It is, in effect, a second construction project you're required to save for before the first one has even paid for itself. Insurance follows a similarly unforgiving pattern. You're insuring billions of dollars of steel and electrical equipment sitting permanently exposed to storms, waves, and saltwater corrosion, with a single named storm event capable of damaging dozens of turbines simultaneously in a way no onshore facility ever has to worry about. Marine construction risk during the installation phase is its own specialized, expensive category of coverage, since a damaged installation vessel or a delayed weather window doesn't just cost money. It can push an entire project's in-service date back by a full season, with every month of delay adding more interest to the construction debt already accruing in the background. So how's a project like this supposed to make money? This is where offshore wind reveals something almost no other energy business has to deal with quite this directly. The revenue isn't really set by the market. It's set by a government auction. Most offshore wind projects sell their power through a long-term contract called a power purchase agreement, locked in at what's known as a strike price, a guaranteed rate per megawatt hour paid regardless of what wholesale electricity is doing that day. Developers bid for these contracts in competitive government auctions, and the price they need to bid at to cover their actual costs, land, construction, financing, decades of maintenance, is called the Levelized Cost of Energy. Current fixed bottom offshore wind runs an LCOE of roughly $95 per megawatt hour. Floating runs meaningfully higher, around $145 per megawatt hour today. That number has been falling for years as the technology matures, and it's genuinely projected to keep falling, down toward the $50 to $65 range by the mid-2030s on some estimates. But falling costs only help you if the auction you're bidding into will actually pay you enough to cover where costs stand right now, today, on the project you're building right now. There's a second variable sitting underneath all of this that has nothing to do with price at all: how much electricity the turbines actually generate. Offshore wind's advantage over onshore and solar has always been a stronger, steadier capacity factor, the percentage of the year a turbine actually produces at or near its rated output, since ocean winds blow harder and more consistently than wind over land. But that number isn't fixed either. It depends on exactly where a lease sits, how the turbines are spaced, and a factor most people never think about called curtailment. When a grid operator instructs a wind farm to reduce output because the local transmission network simply cannot absorb the electricity being produced at that moment. A project can have perfect wind and a perfectly healthy strike price and still lose meaningful revenue because the cable carrying its power to shore is the actual bottleneck, not the turbines themselves. And this is exactly where the entire industry has hit a wall in 2026. The UK government, one of the largest offshore wind markets on Earth, has frozen the maximum price it will pay in its next major auction round at £113 per megawatt hour for bottom fixed wind. If a developer's actual costs, driven up by inflation, higher interest rates, and supply chain pressure since the project was first planned, sit above that ceiling, there is no path to a profitable bid. You can build the exact same turbine in the exact same water and simply lose money on every single megawatt hour you generate, because the price you're legally allowed to be paid was capped below what it actually costs you to deliver it. None of this started in 2026 either, which is worth pausing on. Back in late 2023, Ørsted, the largest offshore wind developer on the planet, walked away from 2 fully leased New Jersey projects, Ocean Wind 1 and Ocean Wind 2, citing supply chain problems and rising costs, with the company's own leadership calling the decision deeply disappointing at the time. A separate New Jersey project, Atlantic Shores, filed to cancel its own state approval less than 2 years later, citing the same combination of political and economic pressure. The wall the industry hit in 2026 wasn't a sudden event. It was the same crack that had already been spreading for 3 years finally reaching the load-bearing wall. Which brings us to what's actually happening across this industry right now, in real time, and it is not subtle. In the United States, a December 2025 executive action halted all 5 major offshore wind farms that were under construction at the time, mid-build, turbines already standing in the water. In the months since, the federal government has been paying developers directly to walk away entirely. The Department of the Interior reached agreements with Blue Point Wind and Golden State Wind to voluntarily terminate their offshore wind leases in exchange for a combined $885 million in reimbursed lease fees. Separately, the government struck a deal worth close to $1 billion with the French energy company TotalEnergies to cancel its leases off New York and North Carolina, refunding the company's lease payments on the condition that TotalEnergies redirect that same amount of money into oil and gas projects instead, and that it never develop another offshore wind project in the United States again. A few months later, the government paid Invenergy $765 million to terminate its own offshore leases under the same arrangement. This is not a slowdown. This is the federal government actively purchasing the industry's exit. Europe's version of the same story is being written by economics rather than executive order, which somehow makes it more unsettling, not less. German utility NBW halted its 3-gigawatt Mona and Morgan offshore wind projects in the UK's Irish Sea after they failed to secure support in a government auction, an outcome that triggered an impairment of more than £1 billion on a single decision. Ørsted, the largest offshore wind developer in the world, cancelled its Hornsea 4 project in the UK, citing rising supply chain costs, higher interest rates, and construction risk, and warned investors the cancellation would directly hurt earnings. Shell began exploring a sale of its wind assets entirely, citing the same trio of pressures: inflation, supply chains, and interest rates. Sweden rejected 11 separate proposed offshore wind farms in a single month, citing conflicts with national defense interests, cutting a meaningful slice out of the country's future development pipeline in one stroke. None of these companies stopped believing wind turbines generate electricity. They stopped believing the economics work at today's costs, today's interest rates, and today's auction prices. What makes this wave different from an ordinary industry downturn is that it's hitting the biggest, best capitalized players in the business, not marginal operators. NBW and Ørsted aren't overleveraged startups. They're among the largest utilities in Europe, with decades of offshore experience and access to some of the cheapest capital in the industry. When companies with that level of financial sophistication and institutional patience are the ones walking away from billion-pound projects, it's a strong signal that the problem is the underlying math, not any one company's execution. Here's the structural lesson sitting underneath every one of these cancellations. Offshore wind projects take years to plan and finance, often 5 to 10 years from lease auction to first power. The costs, the interest rate on your construction debt, the price of steel and specialized vessels, the wages of the crews building it are locked in and rising in real time. Today's dollars, today's rates. But the revenue, the strike price from a government auction held years earlier, was locked in back when interest rates were lower and steel was cheaper. When those two timelines drift far enough apart, a project that made complete financial sense on the day it won its lease can become mathematically unbuildable by the day construction is actually supposed to start. That gap, not a lack of wind, not a lack of demand for clean electricity, is the actual disease currently working through this entire industry. So let's run the numbers on what this actually looks like for a project built today. Say you develop a 1-gigawatt fixed-bottom offshore wind farm. At current benchmark costs of roughly $4 million per megawatt, construction runs around $4 billion. Turbine hardware accounts for roughly 40% of that, $1,600 million, with the remaining 60%, $2,400 million, going to foundations, cabling, and installation. Annual operations and maintenance runs close to $100 million a year. Say you finance 70% of construction, roughly $2.8 billion. Over 20 years, your annual debt service alone lands somewhere in the neighborhood of $250 to $280 million a year. In the optimistic scenario, your project clears its government auction at a strike price around $140 per megawatt hour, and your turbines run at a healthy offshore capacity factor of roughly 45%. That works out to just under 4 million megawatt hours generated a year, and gross revenue somewhere around $550 million annually. After operations and maintenance, you're left with roughly $450 million in operating income. Subtract debt service, and you're clearing somewhere around $170 to $200 million a year. A real, if modest by venture standards, return on $4 billion of invested capital, running for 25 years on a government-backed contract. Stable, unglamorous, genuinely bankable. In the realistic scenario, the auction you're bidding into caps its maximum price below what your actual costs now require, the same wall NBW hit with Mona and Morgan. Your bid either fails to clear the auction entirely, or it clears at a price too thin to cover financing, and the project stalls indefinitely, somewhere between a signed lease and a finished turbine. Billions in site studies, permitting, and early construction spend sit stranded, earning nothing, while interest continues accruing on whatever debt you've already drawn. Your only realistic exit, based on exactly what's happened to developers across the US in the past year, is a negotiated buyout. The government or a new counterparty reimburses a portion of your sunk costs, you write off the rest, and you walk away having spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars to end up with nothing generating any electricity at all. Even in a softer version of this scenario, one where the project does eventually get built but 2 years later than planned, the extra interest accrued during that delay alone can run into the hundreds of millions of dollars, arriving before a single megawatt hour has ever been sold. The gap between those two outcomes isn't a bad quarter. It's the difference between owning a functioning 25-year power plant and owning a permanently canceled hole in the water. That's the real shape of this industry heading into the back half of the decade. The wind hasn't gotten weaker. The turbines haven't gotten less efficient. What changed is the gap between when a project locks in its costs and when it locks in its revenue. And in market after market right now, on both sides of the Atlantic, that gap has gotten wide enough to swallow the entire investment whole. None of this means offshore wind disappears entirely. The projects already generating power under strike prices locked in years ago keep collecting those payments regardless of what happens to the next auction. And falling technology costs are real, even if they're currently losing a race against rising financing costs. But the pipeline of projects that haven't broken ground yet is exactly where the risk is concentrated, and that pipeline is where the cancellations keep landing. An offshore wind farm was never really a bet on whether the wind blows. It's a bet on whether the interest rate, the steel price, and the government auction all still make sense by the time the last turbine finally goes into the water. And right now, for a striking number of projects, they don't.